Greetings, everyone. My name is Joel Ong, and welcome to the panel entitled Life a Sensorium, Perspectives from the Sensorium Exhibition at ISEA 2020. This virtual exhibition entitled Life a Sensorium investigates the nexus of art, science, and technology through the works of artists and researchers affiliated with Sensorium, the Center for Digital Art and Technology at York University in Toronto, Canada. Collectively, this exhibition presents trajectories of research creation through the faculty that explore corporality and adaptation within the varied ecologies of our emerging digital and virtual environments. Through multisensory experiences, mixed reality, and alternative performance structures and installations, the exhibition aims to create effective narratives that extend theories of the post-natural and play witness to the broader trends of artistic interventions inspired by the dynamicism, flux, and evolution of life. So the exhibition Life a Sensorium also provides an opportunity for the reviewing of the diverse research questions explored here through both theoretical and experimental methods at the research unit Sensorium, and to gain perspectives on current and future research clustering here as a way to situate faculty-based research within institutional armatures, as well as within and in response to external trends in broader digital culture. Most poignantly, any unit that seeks to explore digital cultures today has to acknowledge the complex network of social, biological, and cultural factors that dictate the way life is understood today. So I'm very happy today to introduce our panelists. This panel is consisted of the curatorial team for the exhibition, and we will discuss present and past curatorial processes and interrelated themes for discussing the work of art in the context of technology today. Our panelists today are Dr. Janine Marchessault, Dr. Melanie Milmink, and myself. So what is Sensorium? Sensorium is a faculty-based organized research unit in digital arts and technology at York that represents a growing portion of our faculty working at these interdisciplinary frontiers. We are a research center for creative inquiry and experimentation in the digital arts, but the scope of our faculty, research associates, and graduate students extends outward towards broader issues of social engagement and cultural value. We, like many like-minded colleagues around the world, aim to use digitalism not as an end in itself, but as a means to broader cultural and technological critique. So you can see over here, this is a screenshot of our website. Please feel free to visit it. And there's also an events page where you can see what we're up to. So my talk today is entitled Curating Life, Sentience, and Computational Arts. And it basically gives an overview of the 4 research clusters that Sensorium has. My name is Joel Ong, as mentioned. I'm the director of Sensorium right now. I'm also an assistant professor in computational arts at AMPD in York University. So in the exhibition catalog to the Sensorium show at the MIT List Visual Arts Center in 2006 and 7, almost 15 years ago now, Caroline Jones has described, referring to the group of artists there, that the contemporary moment calls for a more creatively dissociated self. The aesthetics of Sensorium artists and curators tend to exacerbate the dissociative potential of contemporary technology, but finds play, not terror, in that prospect. Almost 15 years later today, we still find ourselves within a technological and ecological epoch where these are relevant. And one might think not only of the bodily senses when we say multisensory today, but instead think also more broadly about mixed reality and alternative forms of performance structures, etc. And so we're really interested in the ways we may engage in creative play across these different affordances. And one really interesting mode of dissociation today, which has been prevalent in contemporary discourses and the environmental humanities, is that between life and nature. And you know, on the one hand, dissociation of the word life with nature implies a kind of move away from this idea of nature or wildness as a pristine romantic landscape devoid of human contact, and more in favor of a life or creative vitality that is continually and creatively generated. One might think about the term élan vital from the French philosopher Henri Bergson to think about this mode of creative evolution. But we also are really interested in the way that life itself is kind of generating and breeding new forms. as computation and mediating technologies reveal new post-natural beings and new life forms that kind of grow and breed within these computational worlds. So collectively, these works in this exhibition encourage a viewing of life as a dynamic unfolding of sentience and multisensory aesthetics that emerges from these unlikely couplings, one might call them play, of digital and analog systems, natural and artificial sense-making processes, and emergent forms of knowledge production. So we have four main thematics. The first is called Performance Embodiment and Sentient Systems. And research creation in this area explores the spectrum of performance from public experiences to galleries and proscenium stages with an integrated focus on the intersection of the human body and adaptive media systems. Now, work in this area traverses theories of multisensory experience, applications of sensing technologies, open-ended participatory artificial life environments, and the intersection of machine agents and the performing arts. So some representative artworks are Doug Van Noot's genetically sonified organisms, which are a set of solar-powered creatures designed to interact with one another and within the larger sonic environment that they are immersed. So they're normally situated out in the field through all the different seasons. And the means of communication begins as a call and response, but then it kind of evolves into each of these creatures developing their own vocabulary and evolving their call over the course of a few months. On the right is Freya Olafsson's motion after effect, which reveals how VR technologies can destabilize the meanings of the corporal body in the performance of live gameplay and dance. Our second research cluster is entitled Media Environments and Ecologies, which really looks at the creation of interactive installations and immersive environments, network objects and wearables, digital fabrication and data visualization, but also is very much interested in post-human ecologies that merge multi-species interactions and processes. So in this field, I would highlight two works. One of it's my work, Terra Adventi, which looks at some computational and biological processes of creating clouds, and Nicole Clouston's work, Lake Ontario Portraits, which looks at the evolution of color schemes within a glass vat made by microbes in the soil. These works will be talked about a little bit more in the presentations that follow. The third research cluster is called Future Cinema and Next Generation Gaming. And in this cluster, we think about the creation of new stories for new screens, researchers who are developing integrated performance-based and networked media projects. And these are projects that involve everything from interactive documentary, AR and VR, large format media and pervasive games, alongside site-specific interventions. This area of research seeks to develop digital technologies that are expanding the effective and cinematic geographies of contemporary media cultures. So here we have the artworks After the Dangram by David Hahn, which is a mixed reality interactive art installation inspired by Dangram's 1974 video art installation Time Delay Room 1. And we also have Graham Wakefield and Haruji's Infinite. And Wakefield's project is a generative visual artwork realized through a population of artificial life forms with evolutionary neural networks, thriving upon open geospatial data of the infrastructure of the city as their sustenance and canvas. In the last research cluster, we have social practice and community engagement, which explores how digital and communicative-based media can be creatively used to foster social and political change. And some of examples of the research undertaken in this area include cyber activism, VR and human rights work and public health work, and the building of community connection and dissent through social media. So here we have Alison Humphrey's Shadowpox, which is a full-body video game designed for an art gallery that imagines the emergence of a vaccine-preventable disease composed of viral shadows. Part fact and part science fantasy. This has a lot of resonances with our current condition. And I also highlight Janine Marchessault's Archive Counter Archive project, which looks to review and create new forms of archiving that include both traditional, both contemporary and traditional forms of knowledge. So with that, thank you. I will now hand us over to our next speaker, Janine Marchesser. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joel. All right, so my talk is really more like an expanded abstract, and it is very much a work in progress, really starting to think about the research cluster number 2 that Joel described, media environments and ecologies. So my paper seeks to expand the boundaries of media studies to take the materiality and ecology of the Earth into account, which means bringing climate change into the picture. In this sense, the work belongs to growing research in the area of eco-media. Robert Markley has pointed out that critical climate change studies invariably pose questions about time, or more precisely, different registers of time: experiential or embodied time, historical time, and climatological time. Each of these registers, he argues, resist definition because they're each very, very deeply entangled. And moreover, climatological time is only accessible through and mediated by a range of very complex technologies. So I'm interested in how artists are working to create images and situated experiences for this complex temporality. And I'm inspired by philosopher Catherine Malabou's recent thinking about climate change and her work on plasticity. For Malabou, the current scientific understanding of climate change really needs to connect to the new epistemologies of neuroscience. And like Deleuze, she conceptualizes the brain in terms of decentralized neural networks, connecting the inside and the outside world, the made and unmade cerebral mental scapes. In her recent work, she argues that we need to produce new events as plastic events. We need to invent a new relationship to time, a new relationship between brain and world that incorporates a concept of regenerative plasticity in a way that the past, the present, and future are deeply, deeply entangled, contiguous, and not simply linear. Her new book, Before Tomorrow, has been described as a book about Kant after Kant. In it, she argues against speculative realism, and she offers a view that breaks down the historical opposition between idealism on the one hand and skepticism on the other. Usually you have to choose one or the other. Instead, she argues that transcendentalism is not incompatible with a vision of the world in motion, a world that is highly contingent. I'm going to point briefly to the work of Joel Ong, whose art projects on wind, on microbial worlds, and the new frontier of the atmosphere is offering new perspectives on the temporalities of climate change and on arts science collaborations. I want to, for a moment, reflect on air. And I think that we're all thinking about air this year, which has materialized air through the breathtaking pandemic and the horrific, breathtaking suffocation of George Floyd. And these events have had contradictory after effects, simultaneously pushing people inside and forcing them outside, impelling them outside into the open air of the streets. One of the things that artists do is to visualize possible futures and develop blueprints for unforeseen structures and expanded interfaces with the natural world. This is why these engagements with the elemental that we are seeing with contemporary artistic practice are hugely important and have the potential to create new insights in collaboration with scientific research. Gaston Bachelard's many books on the elements, on fire, earth, air, and water, sought to understand these elements in terms of archetypes that pervade our dreams, our reveries, our imagination. Bachelard's aesthetics, inspired by Romantic poetry, theorized the poetic image as a layering of memory and mythology beyond the individual dreamer. Bachelard's emphasis on reveries and dreams make of these dreams a phenomenological engagement between brain and world that Malabou is, I think, getting at. Joel Ong admires and is inspired by Bachelard's work on the elements and the poetic image and dreaming. He's inspired by the great pneumatics artist and environmental scientist, Graham Stevens, who was among the first to create sensorial embodied engagements with the elements through his massive inflatable balloon-like structures in the mid-1960s, as which he created as environmental conceptual art forms, beginning with early experiments, one called Elastic Touch, which used balloons. Stevens' ideas were extended into large kinetic structures and into a project called Space Field in 1966, which was the first monochromatic pneumatic environment where participants experienced psychological sensory changes in situ. Stevens's kinetic sculptures, Walk in the Earth, we just saw a bunch of them, invited participants to interact with the elemental environment by stepping inside of these shapes. One of Stevens's largest and most famous constructions is Desert Cloud, which was an ongoing project between 1972 and 2004, which was a massive inflatable mylar platform which he filmed in Kuwait as it drifted through the desert like a large cloud, creating shade patches on the ground. The inflatable cloud housed tools that conducted multifaceted explorations of the transformation of energy in weather systems, particularly focused on evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. This experiment with sustainable energy offered a potential tool against drought. And Graham Stevens continues to be very involved in art science collaborations and in energy, sustainable energy research. So his inflatables expressed a new effective materialization of the atmospheric environment as immersive architecture. And of course, Buckminster Fuller was hugely important to these experiments. So influenced by these early experiments, Ong, who works at the edges of the biological and the technological by way of the human, seeks to create semantic bridges between human and non-human worlds. One of his most striking pieces in this regard is a wind piece called Those Who Observe the Wind, which creates instruments for Aeolian music. Wind turbulence data was collected in real time from a nearby weather station in Seattle where the piece was staged, and then it was redistributed, reinterpreted through an array of 16 single-stringed instruments. You can see those here in this illustration, so that the weather data itself is being translated into music. And the piece also incorporated an improvisational workshop with visually impaired children who assembled an instrument with haptic sensing to support their own improvised orchestral performance. As Janine Randerson has written in her book, Weather as Medium, quote, "We know about weather because we can feel it. We can feel a sudden shift in temperature. We can feel a rain shower, but increasingly atmospheric knowledge is a vast data set that is too large and too long historically to be experienced as individuals. We rely on science, therefore, to provide an overall account of climate change as something that really can't be experienced directly. And this is why art science collaborations are so important in translating and producing knowledge. She points out that artists give us access to and ground these data sets in lived experiences. And we see that that in this piece, in those who observe the wind, as the data itself is fed into musical instruments and made accessible to a multiplicity of and a diversity of bodies and perceptions. This is engaging with the complex temporalities of climate. Randerson's book examines the work of many Maori artists in New Zealand and in Australia, and the rich array of contemporary art engaging with the elemental and with clouds in particular. And it is really a movement, I think, that is growing around the world, but I think quite heavily situated in that part of the world. And not surprisingly, Joel Ong did his graduate research in Australia and worked with numerous artists that are in fact part of Randerson's book. One of Ong's most recent project, which I believe he is going to be talking about here at ISEA, is a project called Umwelt Microbiana, developed with Mick LaRusso, who's a collaborator from the UCLA Art Science Collective. This project is perhaps the most surrealist of Ong's projects to date, as it seeks to situate and imagine microbial life in different places across North and South America. The interconnections between microbial life and human life is both imagined and documented. And there's this image is from, and these images are from an essay that they published in last year in an issue of the journal Public, issue 59. And in this article, they essentially recount their experience in developing this microbial project. And the idea is really to find microbes in different parts of the earth and to try to imagine the experience of microbes, or to see the world from the microbes' point of view. And so they really stage different actions and encounters to discover microbes in different situations, in the ground, in the desert, up in the sky. You can see here we conducted flights in different locations to create a map of the microbes that we found. We traced their geographical journeys and created narratives of migration inspired by conspiracy theories about bacteria-controlled weather modifications, et cetera, et cetera. This is, in fact, a performance, and it's somewhat surrealistic, it's absurdist, but it also contains real empirical data. It contains microbes that tell us about the history of the earth, that go back in time and that tell us about potential futures. Here, Ong's training as a biologist comes into play in this Borgesian hunt for life beyond the senses. This microbial life also contains the history of the earth. Ong and LaRusso are committed to developing sensory understandings of the environment that shift and expand our perspectives. Umweltmikrobiana takes its force from what Bachelard called the poetic image, which reveals the interconnectivities and the interdependence of the world, which for Bachelard, science alone could not reveal. It needed art. It needed the poetic image. The poetic image, which encompasses dreaming and imagination, which expands the human capacity for engagement that moves beyond the individual experience out to the collective, out to the planetary. So it's expressly here that artists are exploring the different registers of time when it comes to engaging climate change, experiential or embodied time, historical time, and climatological time. This is a very difficult thing to accomplish. So I think I'll end there. So over to Melanie.
So thank you very much, Joel and Janine. I think this presentation, as I was listening to you guys talk, there's so many similarities about the things that we're interested in, and these ideas keep coming up again and again. Joel spoke a little bit about these issues of play and playfulness. Janine spoke about this idea of poetic speculation and how you can think differently through artworks and these intersections between art and technology. And then also thinking about microbial agency and this microbial point of view. All of these things are going to come up in my discussion as well. But I'm going to take a sort of oblique discussion to our Life as Sensorium exhibition by looking at one of my previous exhibitions and talking a little bit about my curatorial strategy there, and then tying it all back together, hopefully in a nice bow. So, the pursuit of knowledge is always an act of stretching for the unknown, of believing that there's something just out of reach, even if one can't quite see it. Art offers an entry point into forms of experience that supersede human limits, but it is long being dismissed as superfluous or illogical. Yet, it is uniquely situated exactly because it is not limited by the idea that it has to communicate some sort of truthfulness. An artwork can and does lie to you, or require you to participate in a fantasy. It asks questions instead of providing answers, and it provokes seemingly irrational responses. Over the years, I've used visual and media arts to intervene into non-art realms with projects that have functioned as gestures of knowledge production to create together the embodied experience of being with art and the critical discussion that circulates around exhibitions. For my case study here, I want to talk a little bit about my 2019 exhibition with Sidewalk Labs Toronto, the Alphabet or Google-funded urban development firm that proposed to transform urban planning from the ground up. As part of a longer curatorial residency where I spent time on site speaking with their staff and visitors, I created a one-day winter warmer exhibition to introduce art installations into the public display of their 307 office space, with the intention of integrating artistic research into the important urban planning conversations circulating around the Sidewalk project. Because the event was structured as an open house to show off Sidewalk's recent developments, I was asked to engage a structure they call the raincoat, and that you can see here, an ETFE plastic membrane that was used to create a transparent patio space on the exterior of the building. The idea was to use the patio extension to create a comfortable and porous space between the interior and exterior of the building. Thinking about this space, I kept coming back to the idea of public space, porousness, and the fragile agreements that are in place in these spaces that belong to no one. Obviously, Sidewalk site was a private space for a business, but one that was being purposely made public to share their ideas and promote their business plan. It was an extremely contentious site, as you may or may not know. Many Toronto citizens were against the Sidewalk project because of Google's involvement as a huge American tech corporation that makes money through data collection. Yet, It was also a space that was imagining new possibilities for the public realm, and perhaps even technologies that would be helpful in the face of rising costs of living and the environmental damage of both the production of construction and the lived-in urban environment. In the end, my curatorial premise was inspired by media scholar Dr. Sarah Swain, who has proposed the idea of feral hospitality to describe a space that is contingent and in constant negotiation between entities that have fundamentally different understandings about the world. She explores this idea through a documentary called Kedi, which traces the lives of street cats in Istanbul. Dr. Swain posits that the caretaking interactions between the humans and the cats is a mutual gesture that pushes against the traditionally clear understanding of home, accommodation, belonging, host, and guest. This idea became an integral way to link all of the artworks inside and outside of the 307 office space, exploring the shared ecologies and interrelationships between the site, the architecture, technology, artwork, spectators, staff, and other living creatures in the area, as well as the ways that all of these entities had a stake in how the site was being built and utilized. All of the artworks, from Nicole Clouston's Lake Ontario portrait to Michael Palumbo's recursive writing to Graham Wakefield and Haruji's conservation of shadows, engaged this idea, as spectators came up against microbial, computational, and other human entities that presented their own sense of agency in the encounter. The artworks asked viewers to step into a mode of perception that wasn't necessarily human, and to consider the collaborative and interactive nature of the art encounter, but also to ask how these things were relevant to Sidewalk's larger project. The image you can see here, Conservation of Shadows, probably demonstrates this most clearly because it set up a mixed reality installation where spectators could see a VR scenario while being simultaneously located in a physical site where projection mapped shadows interacted with the physical environment as both visual shadows and sensors that triggered ringing bells. The creatures inside the VR simulation held their own agency, moving in swarms that did not always respond to human presence, but could occasionally be tempted to interact and play. The idea of play is extremely important here because it's a gesture of playfulness. It's in the gesture of playfulness that boundaries come down, and we can imagine different ways of functioning in our environments and interactions. In the book Homo Ludens, Johannes Huizinga famously described play as the most fundamental quality of a lived, embodied being, which contributes to both social cultural bonding and is a basic exploration or learning about the world. He explains that play is at once fun and serious, that it is, 1, voluntary, 2, stands outside of ordinary life, and 3, creates its own order or rules. By setting aside a space and time for play, creating what he calls a magic circle, humans choose to participate in pushing the boundaries of what they know, and they do so together. This describes what Huizinga describes as feeling of being apart together in an exceptional situation, of sharing something important, of mutually withdrawing from the rest of the world and rejecting the usual norms, which retains its magic beyond the duration of the individual game, end quote. In this act of play, shared imagination and creation, humans can begin to think differently and problem solve together. Within the Winter Warmer, I asked spectators to participate in this gesture of playful exploration, not just with other humans, but also with the technological objects, non-human entities, and even the site of the Portlands to explore what the future might hold. Staff feedback after the event often pointed to the artworks as contributing a new sensibility to the open house. They had held events previously, but those often drew a crowd that was more specifically interested in Sidewalk's policies and innovations, and who had already formed judgments about the project. Whereas this event felt like it attracted a more general interest crowd, who were curious and explorative. Facilitators noticed that the art enabled a neutral way for people to drift into conversations about their topics of interest, rather than coming out with direct, often antagonistic, queries. Sidewalk Lab's staff also had a slightly different engagement with the artworks than spectators at the Winter Warmer, because they were able to encounter them for a longer period of time. It was particularly interesting to hear their responses in relation to Nicole Clouston's Lake Ontario portrait, which is a piece Joel showed earlier and is actually included in the Life at Sensorium exhibition as well, which housed mud and microbes in a plexiglass tubes arranged in fields of color, almost like an abstract painting. The mud had coincidentally been collected from the Portland site near where the 307 office building was located. It was simple and quiet and was often overlooked during the busy Winter Warmer event. Yet, when asked, most of the staff that I spoke to pointed to Nicole's artwork as their favorite piece. Andrew Miller from the mobility team noted that the piece prompted a kind of, quote, magical thinking because, quote, the soil comes from our site. It has special meaning and resonance here because it is of this place, end quote. He also pointed to the artwork's inclusion of living creatures and his appreciation for the fact that it would change over time and grow with the project. The staff seemed to form a relationship with the microbes and enjoyed being able to watch the artwork up close, peering in to see small creatures swimming or forming different colors over time. Despite this work being ostensibly less interactive than something like Harper and Graham's piece, in some ways it prompted Sarah's notion of feral hospitality much more clearly than some of the other artworks. It linked staff to the site that they were working on and to the creatures that are often forgotten and ignored in urban planning, including these microbes, as well as the birds, the rabbits, and even mice that existed in the place with them. We had originally imagined the ISEA-affiliated exhibition Life at Sensorium as aligned with many of these ideas. Comprised primarily of complicated media installations, the works all push the boundaries between physical and virtual spaces, temporalities, and the interactions. Even the fully VR exhibitions required physical setups, since most people have limited access to VR technology. Unfortunately, with COVID, physical encounters are no longer possible at this time, and we had to adjust to present the works as best as we could in an online format. This ended up meaning that we chose not to present the works at all as artworks, because they simply don't translate to the entirely virtual context. Instead, we had designed documentation interactions, which leveraged the virtual's capacity to enter the artist's studio and access their own personal conception of their practice. If the exhibition had been envisioned a little differently at an earlier stage, we might have been able to find a selection of work that was designed solely for a virtual context, or which could explore the interactive and playful possibilities of online and virtual spectatorial engagements in a way that would be just as rich as in-person experiences. We did accomplish this in a way with a few of the 360 videos that were always intended for viewing on a computer monitor, as well as David Hahn's new work, which builds on the After Dan Graham piece and is designed to be a standalone sort of video game screen-based encounter. The virtual does not exclude the possibility of play and community and exploration, but it does need to be treated as its own unique material space, and experiences need to be designed accordingly. So, in thinking about curating for the virtual and for the Life at Sensorium exhibition specifically, the question is less about how do we translate the physical to a new technology-driven platform, but rather, how do we get people to choose to participate in knowledge production in these environments? What does it look like to design virtual environments that let us step outside of our ordinary uses of Zoom, Twitter, email, or even VR spaces to create something akin to Huizinga's magic circle of play? And finally, how do we work together to establish new rules for playful engagement with one another, where we can expand the possibilities of our thinking and work together when our physical bodies are no longer in proximity with one another? When thinking about curating in this way, as not just deciding objects of interest, but rather curating a shared ecology, then we can decide to open up new possibilities together. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you all for joining us for this talk, and we look forward to the Q&A that's going to follow. We're looking forward to having conversations with you and hearing your thoughts about the exhibition.
Okay, so thank you very much. It was a very lively presentation and it ran for the whole time. I was hoping I could do with some introductions, but it didn't seem possible. But now I think I think people know who you are from your presentations, so I don't have to redo it, I don't think. But I've got a few questions that are really interesting. I really like the way in which you talked about poetic image is needed from the artist to explore these areas of the sensorium, and the show sounds fantastic. I'd love to see it. I'd start with a question that I think is really interesting, and that is, what is the difference for all of you between, say, for example, a show like this and one in a science museum with a lot of actually factual and material as part of the exhibition? What's the difference for you?
Perhaps I can go first. Thanks, Jill, so much.
Yeah.
Everybody, if you don't know, this is Jill Scott, the Jill Scott, who needs no introduction, really. You know, it was interesting because the original exhibition was one of the places that the original exhibition was supposed to be in was actually a Natural History Museum in Montreal. And we did think about the way that this would contextualize a lot of the things that we were talking about. Because one of the original impetus, I think, for naming this the way it was really to think about life as the end of wilderness, you know, to kind of think about it, you know, and maybe a kind of semi-depressing way. But, you know, the way that art was starting to become a very potent and necessary force in shaping our interactions with the environment. In the previous panel I was in, we talked a little bit about the constraints of the human in trying to engage with the environment, and then where the limits of our bodies end. That's where imagination, you know, starts to extend this. And of course, with technological augmentation, you know, these are the affordances for where these for the forms that these imaginations may take. So, you know, for me, I think that you know, having it conceptualized within a natural history museum, for me personally, was like the ultimate, would have been a really, really good way, you know, to have people observe that immediately as a kind of strange discomfort, as to, you know, why is there you know, this odd kind of fictional entities that are coexisting with information. You know, because the Natural History Museum would provide information about the world around us. And, you know, I mean, a lot can be said about the way that, you know, like we've transported that, you know, from the initial idea in the Natural History Museum to actually a studio space proposed, you know, at the NAD. And then, you know, now even porting it into a digital format as well. So, you know, there's been a lot of these interesting dissociations, I think, with the original idea.
Yeah, does anyone else want to answer that question or say
Yeah,
something?
I was so excited about the possibility of actually staging this at the McCord Museum, which is a beautiful museum, but also the chance to bring artworks into a science museum. That's why Bachelard is so great, because he does recognize the interface between science and art as actually creating new kinds of knowledge. And Joel, you've done work in science museums. So I do think that opportunity, when the world opens up again, will be a good one to kind of create kind of hybrid engagement, you know, and to create new kinds of knowledge. I think that what we've done now with the interviews with the artists and little excerpts of documentation, and in some cases the actual videos is great, but it's actually something else. It's wonderful to have the artists there talking about their work, but it's something else. I think that original idea of working with the Science Museum is really special and really important.
But yeah, I think it's interesting, doesn't it also relate to this idea of the actual production processes changing as well, that people are now going on field trips with scientists who are artists. They're having residencies in science research, and you know, the effect of shadowing on field trips and of accompanying scientists on field trips is a very embodied experience that brings a lot of different kinds of interpretations to science, in fact.
Yeah. I mean,
I would just add as well that I think that for me, curating is about the conversation that's developed between objects. And I think definitely in a natural history museum or with a scientific context, the conversation that artworks can have and the possibilities for the ideas that arise in the tensions between them is quite different than you might see in a regular white cube art gallery, where all of the objects are considered as artworks first and foremost. So that for me was just an extension to the question.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting how basically the infective, I mean, I think when you're an artist like you are, that is engaging, for example, I mean, artists who are engaging in scientific discussions are also perhaps want to bring those discussions more to the public and to the art public, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sorry, I might have misposed the question earlier, but I think it might be okay. There seems to be...
Actually, just to tell you, I talked about you going on these field trips with scientists and working, and how important that is in relation to what you produce.
Yes. No, I think that's...
your show.
Yeah. Which is some of the things that I do a lot with my kids nowadays, because of you know, like they're 3.5 now, and we take them on these field trips. I'm not a biologist per se, you know, but I'm very, very excited about worms and stuff in the dirt. So that's our little like backyard science that we do almost on a daily basis. What I think is, you know, there are a couple of projects that we're invested in at Sensorium that look at citizen science pieces. And, you know, you're really right. I think there is, you know, when you hit the field, there is a kind of democratization of information and collective learning that creates these really exciting opportunities for, you know, communal creativity or co-development of ideas, right? And so, you know, I'll say we are doing a project where we are trying to gamify a bee identification toolkit, and that is something that is you know, in line with a lot of citizen science initiatives, where you go into the field and you try to observe the environment and you try to locate you know, what pollinated species are there, so that, you know, when you add that to an app like iNaturalist, for instance, there will be a kind of database that's created that science could not do because of the scope of its engagement on its own. You know, so like there are two parts to it, I think, where there's the utilitarian function of actually being in the field and contributing to a very tangible and direct science. And then there's also the reciprocal imaginative conversations that may happen around, you know, the kind of subjective responses you may have to field studies, for instance, you know.
So do you feel that you're a catalyst trying to bring science to the public in any particular way?
I think, you know, that's what we are all trying to do very much. You know, I want to say the theoretical underpinnings for a lot of our works are informed very heavily by things like neuroscience, by philosophies of mind, consciousness and sentience, and so there is like I will probably speak for all of us by saying that while we are interrogating the frontiers of science and engineering, there's a common ground that we can speak about, because these are unresolved issues. I think that only such conversations can start to pry apart.
Okay, and now let's move that to talking about the environment, which I think is really important contributor to this issue. I mean, all of you are engaged in trying to get the audience to ask why and think more deeply about the environment. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what kinds of tactics do you think you're using? I know we talked about play, but it's quite hard, isn't it? I mean, science is in a lot of trouble to bring a lot of issues to the public. So what kind of tactics you as a curator, for example, Janine, are using to bring this to the public?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in my talk, this idea of climatological time is really complex. And I think scientists are now open to engaging with artists to actually communicate with larger publics, to have dialogues and conversations and new forms of pedagogy. So yeah, I've been involved in site-specific exhibitions. I did one in a heritage museum a couple of years ago that was very much about climate change. It was about unsustainable development, and it was about trying to live together, in a sustainable way, so I do think that's been a shift now with these art science collaborations. It's not just co-creation, it's the recognition that artists are able to create situations that bring a number of different communities together to have conversations about climate.
I would add to that as well. I think that it's important to recognize that often art science projects are a little bit instrumentalized and really only looked at as a way to communicate about science, to illustrate art as an illustration. And I think there's also an important recognition in what Janine was saying about art actually playing a role in that knowledge development, and the way that making objects and using artistic processes can create these sort of distances between what we know and what we don't know. And we can use artwork to create sort of glitches or ruptures in what we know, in order to think differently. And a lot of my curatorial process and academic research is about how do we turn against the experience of what we recognize and what we know, to make it unrecognizable. And I think art does that really well, because it sort of takes these things that we assume about the world and it shows it to us in a different way so that we can reconsider it.
Like sonification is a perfect example of that actually process in a way. Yeah.
And a lot of the other artwork in the exhibition as well do that. If we look at the Shadow Pox artwork by Alison Humphrey, where she's using a video game sort of projection mapping to talk about viruses and immunization, and using the idea of play and a game to sort of take this thing that we all sort of know about. We know that it's important to immunize and it has these real effects on the world. Suddenly, it's putting it on our bodies in a way that is not quite as familiar as we're used to seeing it. And we have to stop and reconsider it.
I think that, exhibitions on climate change if they advertise themselves as being about climate change, are not always the most interesting ones. I actually think our exhibition all of the pieces are engaging with climate and with the environment, with ecological issues. But one of the things that they all have in common is about expanding perception and about speaking cross-culturally, cross-generationally, about interrelationalities. And so that's why, I love Joel's piece with microbes, right? It's odd. It's to actually think about microbes as having a life and having a subjectivity. So that's why if you look at the pieces, you'll see a playfulness in a lot of them. And it is about, because it's very much about getting beyond the kind of discursive analysis of climate change and really towards new forms of experience.
Okay. Does anyone else want to say something about that? I've got another question that's a bit controversial.
Oh, go for that one.
Okay. One of those. It's actually about the production of artwork, particularly the use of plastic in work that's about the environment, and about the kind of consciousness that you think of that issue, and about the paradox of that issue, that we're all using materials that are in fact detrimental to the environment, maybe about environmental issues. And the question is, what do you think about that controversy?
Well, I will let Joel answer that, and then I have an answer after Joel.
Okay, good.
Well, I'm not sure if I can provide an answer to that. I mean, I'm definitely, it's something that we struggle with quite a little bit. We, on top of flying to ecological conferences and, doing this over Zoom, as you know, digital technology also has a carbon footprint that is growing. We also run a makerspace that does involve a lot of plastic, and there's a kind of very balance that needs to be made between this desire for iterative prototyping as a way to research creation, and then to create sustainable like avenues for people to be environmentally conscious. So I think there definitely is a responsibility on the part of the artists. And this is also tough, because it's there are a lot of unique situations that require these so-called sacrifices of like very particular types of materials for the art, in order to convey that kind of emotion. And I feel like we are actively looking for sustainable alternatives to 3D printing, like biodegradable filament, like recycling filaments, things like that. Like really, really simple stuff, but also kind of looking deeper into the institution at an institutional level, like what is the movement infrastructure of recycled materials and reusing of these materials across all the artistic production spaces, so that the waste actually does not stay as waste and get processed as such, but actually goes back within the workflow of somewhere else. Yeah, that's all I can say at this point.
Yeah,
okay, somebody else has got something to say, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, that's a good answer, and I think that truthfully, we don't pay enough attention to that. This exhibition that I put together a couple of years ago, it was called Landslide, and it was all about new ecologies. And when it came time to strike the exhibition of 30 artists, there was so much waste, and everything went to the dump, basically. So I do think there has to be a shift in consciousness. I mean, certain artists do already have that, but I think Melanie, it's up to us in a way as curators to actually insist on it. It'd be great if we did that with Sensorium, Joel.
Okay.
Yes, I think definitely as a curator, you have some I mean, some choice of the artist that you're working with and the structures that you're sort of setting up around the exhibition and the thematic of it to create conversation around these ideas. I think often it's left up to the artist to choose their materials, and some artists are more thoughtful about the materials than others. And then there's also a balance of sort of the logistics of how their artwork functions. Some materials aren't replaceable, right? And the idea of our materials being toxic to the environment is not unique to technological artworks. I mean, painting and printmaking is just as bad for the environment as building a computer-based installation. But artists have sort of addressed these issues over time, trying to find more sustainable materials. One of the things when I was working on the Sidewalk project was actually interesting because Sidewalk had gotten so much pushback about their data collection. They were quite cognizant about anything in their space that was collecting data and the sort of invisible material of the artwork that I think the artists weren't thinking about in the same way as this corporation that had really sort of gotten pushback about the data collection. And we had to fill out all of these forms in advance to consider what sort of data was being collected, how long it was being stored for, what it was being used for. And things like the Connect was collecting all of this information. And it was something that I hadn't encountered before, and I think the artists hadn't encountered before. And it's something that I think we should start thinking more about. These invisible things and materials that are now floating around the technology and the artworks that we're using.
Yeah, and then of course there's a lot of artists who are really addressing those issues by thinking about making work about plastic waste, about recycling, about those issues. Hopefully, how many politicians have come to your exhibition?
This one?
How many politicians?
The Sensorium exhibition?
Yeah. How many politicians do you think have come? Because I think that, this is another issue. How do we get to the people who count, who can make decisions about the future with these kinds of exhibitions?
I mean, that's one of the bits of presenting artworks in alternative spaces is that you don't have to wait for them to come to you. You can go to them, right? You can show City. Janine did Blanche a few years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nuit Blanche is, talk about waste. It's a 24-hour festival which appears and disappears. But what is actually fantastic about Nuit Blanche is that there are a lot of works that are very political and very much about needing to change our habits and needing to bring climate change into our perceptual frameworks. But there are politicians that go to it, and I think it's just as you're, I think, trying to bring in the importance, highlighting the importance of having those conversations. And what I think what happens in those cases is that the mayor loves Nuit Blanche because it makes everybody feel good, and art is a way of connecting. But it would be good to actually just push that attention towards more concrete action.
Absolutely. I think that's something we should all hopefully can look forward to. Yeah. I think I'm going to just move on now, if you don't mind. If you've got, I know you've had many questions for each other, but I think you've always answered those. So I think what we're going to do is move on to some of the chat questions, because I think that's really important. And somebody has asked actually, how do you validate the work as art science as opposed to art alone? And I think we've answered that somewhat, I think. That's one question. What do you think? I think we've answered that question fairly.
I like that question, though, because I think the art science collaborations are complex. And I do think, to me, it's very interesting that Joel is trained as a biologist. So does have a certain kind of understanding and also a method of engagement. So I think it has to do with kind of power relations. I mean, the expeditions to the Arctic, I think that you were referring to, Jill. I mean, I think the hierarchy between the artists and the scientists is quite pronounced. You know, whereas what Joel's a great example of an artist who is also a scientist. It's definitely a good question to really think about the power dynamics at work.
I think it's interesting because, sorry.
No, we always
I was going to say it's interesting.
I was just going to say artists can ask all those great why questions, I think, that are a little bit more provocative, but okay, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's difficult to, you can validate it in a lot of different ways. And sometimes it's the artist saying that this is an art science project and it's about the collaboration with scientists or working towards a purposeful sort of knowledge exploration that treads into art science. And other times it's the curator situating it in a new context. And I think it's possible for artworks that would traditionally be gallery artworks to move into a new context, like an exhibition in a natural history museum or in a tech company, and suddenly become art science because suddenly the exhibition context is putting this framework around it. So I think it's interesting. It's a very slippery concept, and it shifts depending on how you're talking about the artwork and where you're talking about the artwork.
Does anyone else want to say something?
Yeah, I might just add that, you know, it's really a lot about that balance, you know, because at both ends of the spectrum, I would argue that, you know, between the arts and the sciences, you know, it's you know, they're both very high levels of technical proficiency that are required on both sides, you know, and so having that in may sometimes be a question of politics and, you know, institutions as well. But then I think, you know, very fundamentally, I think, you know, like Jill, as you've brought up, this relationship with I guess, public or decision makings, you know, like the vitality, I think, of biomedia today is really embroiled within this kind of folds or networks of you know, commercialization and industry as well that we cannot ignore. And so, you know, to say it as art science is kind of locating it within a specific context that you want to, you know, present an argument for.
There's something to be said also about biomimicry here, perhaps in a way of, particularly about behavior. Like, for example, projects which do show over a period of time decay of or water pollution over periods of time. So the time factor is also really important to bring in here, I think. Okay, so I mean, I don't know how much time we've got left, but I don't see any more questions here that are really related. People want the names of your books and things like that. That's in the chat. So, I mean, I guess that chat can be saved and sent to you. But otherwise, there's no other questions unless anybody else from the public has one and they can put it in quickly. So, but I do want to say ask you something about biomimicry. It's quite a different trajectory, and maybe something that's really interesting is to think about the simulation of new products that are in fact related to the environment. Does anyone want to say anything about that? That it might be another way to start to deal with this material and behavioral kind of discrepancy in a way between our commodity way of life and nature, in a way.
Yeah, I want to say yes. I think, you know, in at least two of the artworks that are in our exhibition, one by Graham Wakefield and one by Doug Van Noort, you know, they really look at simulations of these, I guess, the vitality of biological agents. In Graham's case, this is a virtual world that he's set up where these agents are interacting almost like an ecosystem. And in Doug's case, he actually positions these sound sculptures that he has created within the field where they're actively reacting to the sounds around them and generating their own kind of call and response between themselves and the environment. So a lot of it, it's about access to these maybe communication structures with the purpose of understanding more about what processes are going on, and perhaps, hopefully, this engenders some kind of an ethics and empathy that I guess we've been talking about through the course of this conference. But it's also a way for us to situate our bodies and our beings within that interaction as well. So I think biomimicry, yes, it can definitely be used as a form of access into the domains that we can't otherwise experience.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We've got 20 minutes still to talk, so it's quite a long time. I just asked, actually. I would encourage anybody who's still watching this to please ask questions. It's really important. I noticed that the audience questions are not coming in and not coming much into the chats and from the chats into the panels, and I think that's a bit sad. So please ask questions if you're listening to this still. And there's a question already from biomimicry. For biomimicry, do you think by designing technology around natural phenomena, we may be able to produce an illusion that the technology is better for the environment? Interesting question. That's something to think about.
Yeah,
it's a very tricky question. I mean, it's so big. I think one of the things that's the technology that we use becomes so naturalized around us that it's easy to forget these sort of difficult repercussions of it, right? Like even what we're doing right now is using computer technology that's got devastating environmental impacts in terms of mining, in terms of data servers that are using a lot of energy, in terms of labor practices as well. And I think that artists are able to, again, create these ruptures and gaps to turn our attention to some of these things that are often ignored as part of it. And I think that using biomimicry in artworks or in our technology definitely could lead to us sort of ignoring the repercussions of it. But then again, it also offers opportunities for artists to intervene and create awareness around it as well.
Mm. There's some good sites on biomimicry, and there's some very interesting sort of new trajectories from industrial designers now about the possibilities of new materials, new ways of doing things, new ways of dealing with learning from behavior, actually, from natural systems of behavior. And I think that's really interesting. Does anyone else want to say anything about biomimicry?
I was just going to say, maybe it's also possible that the biomimicry will lead to actual better solutions, better technology that would be more environmentally friendly as well.
That's what they hope for, yes. Because in nature, there's no waste. It's kind of interesting. Nature doesn't produce, well, it deals with its own waste. So that's quite interesting. Okay, there's another question. I wanted to ask for a suggestion of what long-term biodegradable computational art from the Sensorium would look like.
There we go.
Head of Sensorium, what do you have to say about this?
Well, we have been talking about a whole process of physical computing in plein air, and this is inspired by the I can't remember Bio Art Lab. I think that's run by Jennifer Willett some time ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah, is that what I can't? I'm sorry. I wasn't in Canada at that time, but point is in that there were some artists, Paul Vanus in particular, who started looking at PCR techniques out in the field, and so he had this like really interesting camp oven that he started to boil and do all these alternating experiments, and so they were really nice. And we started thinking about a way that we could start doing some of the experiments that we've been doing at in our classes, I guess, or through Sensorium, about computation as a metaphor, but also as a kind of DIY low-tech process. Yeah. So what does procedural computation look like, I guess, in the field? And what would happen if your materials were not silicon, but organic?
Shoeboxes.
Soil. Yeah. Soil.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Soil, mycelium,
Yeah.
bacteria, etc. And there is some headway in that. I would hesitate to give the examples that are currently still in progress and half baked. So I will probably wait for another opportune moment to share them.
Yeah. It's a subject of a lot of industrial design departments at the moment. And it's very interesting, I think, to create new materials out of bioorganic waste and all kinds of issues like that. It's very much happening.
Yeah.
So it's something that maybe that's interesting to think about, cross-fertilizing art fields a little bit more, so that the designers who have those knowledges mix and work more with the artists, so that actually there's a blending and more collaboration within the arts about these subjects.
Yeah, I mean, I look at our faculty, the Faculty of Media, Arts, Performance, and Design, and I think we're missing music. And that was always, this is going back, 30 years, the dream of the deans that take over the faculty to actually find a way to integrate all of these different departments. Of course, that's a kind of very McLuhan-esque idea that the media itself become a sensorium and work together. And at this point, that is not happening. Those conversations are just beginning to happen. There are various departments, of course, that are working together, but not enough. I was thinking design needs to come in. Engineering is coming in and through computation, theater, cinema, and media. But I do think that design might be the missing link.
Yeah, that's. Actually, it's also a Bauhaus issue, isn't it? It can, there's a history of interaction between departments, and where, like when I was teaching at the Bauhaus University, it was amazing. You had to have a theme, and then anybody could join, from engineers to architects to designers to artists, in the same class. Yeah, it was completely a different way of teaching. So you got a lot more collaborative potentials, in fact, out of blending the arts. And I'm sure there'd be more collaborative potentials out of blending the sciences as well. It's like really true.
It does seem like design departments maybe are able to push towards it a little bit more, because they may have a bit more industry and like connections outside of their institution. Like I know Ontario College of Art and Design University, and then NSCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University, are both working on some interesting interdisciplinary projects that are really merging like design with sort of industry practices and testing new technologies and materials. So maybe it's just about the institutional structure a little bit as well.
I think so. I think it's the connection to industry. We're a traditional fine arts, and a lot of programs are fine arts, which still upholds that opposition to commodity culture for good reason. But I think that's the connection to industry, which in the colleges, in the art colleges, have historically not endorsed an opposition to industry, but actually embraced kind of entrepreneurial methodology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that exchange might be much more engagement with the microscopic level, with a different kind of scale. I think that's one problem, really, that we don't. I mean, when you think about it, the general public knows so little about the bacteria, the viruses that we are all made of. It's quite incredible how the lack of knowledge about biology is really perpetrated, and it's very, very sad, really, within the disciplinary system that it's shared issues like that are really not happening. There's one more question, but I think, well, there's two questions actually. And I think I'll just, there's another one. Okay, the other question is a one for me, but I think I can share it with you. How could political systems of representation really change how art with ecological questions can bring other types of human other than human agencies? That's a hard question.
That's a hard question.
Yeah. You want me to just tell you it, say it again?
Yeah.
How could political systems of representation, I think they mean with politicians, really change how art with ecological questions can bring other types of human other than human agencies?
Yeah. How to bring non-human actors into the picture, and
yeah,
politicians care about them.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty much the case.
That's an eternal question, isn't it?
Yeah,
make politicians care about anything.
That's actually the question.
That really is. What do they care about?
Well, actually, we went. I remember some politicians were telling me that they just take the same speech and change the keywords. They just need 10 keywords on any subject, and because they need to have 10 keywords on every subject, they actually don't know much about any subject. This is quite problematic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something the politicians have to change.
Well, if I may, actually, I mean, I think especially in Toronto, I want to say that there's been a large resurgence in interest in social imbalance. So obviously that's a worldwide. Sorry about the garbage truck outside. That's something that's going on across the world right now. And what we've noticed is there's a lot of interest in literacy in communities with, a lot of inherent social cultural imbalances, right? So at York and, with Sensorium as well, I think we do quite a number of community-based projects, and some of them involve digital literacy, and some of them involve DIY science and technologies as well, and community music programs, etc. And I think these are the ways that we're slowly starting to shape public discourse in the immediate environment around our university, but also in the ways that it's a reciprocal exchange again. The ways that the governing structures are actually starting to open up and listen more to them. We can be in a certain way like catalysts for them to be able to get their voices heard in a little bit, through like mixed media or digital literacy, things like that.
Yes, every bit helps to raise awareness. I think that's really what it's about, raising awareness. Another question. Although there's a comment actually about that, says, seems to me politics in its colonial form of rational agency is incompatible with a broader sense of agency. The dismantling of the system may only be only a solution. So that's quite interesting. It's a comment. But there's also another comment, another question up here. Janine, it's for Janine. Janine, you raised the idea of different kinds, scales of time. I'm curious how you see yourselves engaging with scale, temporal or physical. whether you found interesting strategies or points of possibility, or how in general you consider scale within your processes. Great question.
Yeah.
Maybe you can copy it in the chat if you want.
I'm not sure what is what's meant by scale. Is it the scale of public or
scale of time?
Mm.
Yeah.
I think it was the idea of the
that is why. Yeah, that's why I do love. I find Malibu's work so interesting, and you know, she's given a couple of talks on climate change, and in one of them, she actually made a call out to artists to reinvent time, and she said we have to actually, you know, this idea that the world is, you know, ending and everything is dying. We have to obviously, we have to change the way that we live on the earth, the way that we think about each other, the way that we think about non-human animals and the environment, etc. But fundamentally, she said, artists have to help us to reinvent time, and it is that the relationship between past, present, and future. And that's why I have this archive project, fairly simple. It's moving image archives in about 15 community and artist run archives across Canada, and getting artists to engage with these archives. These archives are dying, decaying. There's no money to keep them alive. They hold history, some of the most marginalized voices in Canada, but getting artists to actually push them into the future and flip over kind of images of the past. But yeah, to me, that's that, you know, we were talking about climate change exhibitions. That's the way I would approach it, is actually through a focus on temporality and working with artists that are engaging with temporality through various media. I don't think that there's any one medium that's going to lead the way. I'm interested, I mean, coming out of McLuhan myself, I'm interested in media materiality. And so in the relationship, you know, between media and comparative media studies, to create these kinds of perceptions and conversations.
Yeah, there's a little comment on what he means also by time there, or she means, Jenny is, Flippetti. She says time, or also physical macroscopic scale. Yeah. So maybe that's another extension of the question. But I mean, that's interesting about the relationship between how micro and macro scales can really deal with these sorts of subjects. If we take things much more local instead of global, that's sort of a strategy, if you like, to deal with these very complex subjects like climate change.
Well, again, I hate to put you on the spot, Joel, but as an artist, for, you know, the work that you're doing, and I mentioned that at the end of the paper, this, you know, thinking about microbes that you've gotten through a cloud that contain historical elements that are tied to the history of the earth. So, you know, you kind of can go into deep history, and then at the same time creating performances and writing, you know, and narratives that to frame them.
Yeah, I want to say that's not an idea that I came up with. You know, like the ice core and it being a database for information, air that was, you know, like around millions of years ago. There's an indigenous myth as well that talks about how every time the ice melts, you know, a virus is released into the atmosphere, and you know, some believe that is the cause for the COVID-19 pandemic, the melting. So there's that kind of like, you know, broad ecosophical planetary kind of interrelation.
Yeah, ISEA's archive. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so I think probably we want to start slowing down now, and I think it's been a really interesting panel. Does anyone want to say something very specific at this point, at the closing of the session?
I would just probably do my job and say, please, for all of you who are listening, please do feel free to come to our exhibition. I think Melanie has added that in the chat room, and also go to our website and see what we've been up to and see all the wonderful research that's taking place at York University School of the Art, Media, Performance, and Design. And I also want to extend a great thank you to Janine and Melanie for being, collaborators on this journey. And definitely to Jill, thank you so much for moderating this panel. It's been amazing.
Jill.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great to meet you.
Yeah, it's very nice to meet you all, and good luck with your search for a nice future.
Thank you so much.